Hello, we are back for the next part of Nancy Drew Book 2, The Hidden Staircase. Now, if you'll remember where we left off last time, Nancy had discovered that her father had been abducted from the train station and she was rushing back home to Twin Elms where she's staying with Helen and Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary. But she was thinking about some things and trying to figure out where this hidden passageway was and all that. And she ended up stopping along a road and inspecting an opening that was a cave that didn't go very far. But there was a strange man at her car when she went back toward the car, and it was the man with the crinkled left ear, one of them who had abducted her father. So let's see what happens. The stranger inspecting Nancy's car must have heard her coming. Without turning around, he dodged back to the automobile he was in and started off across the field. He acts suspicious, Nancy told herself. He must be the man with the crinkly hair who helped abduct my father, she thought. Quickly, she crossed the road and ran after him as fast as she could, hoping to overtake him, but he had a good head start. Also, his stride was longer, and Nancy could not cover as much ground as he could. The far corner of the irregular-shaped field ended at the road on which Riverview Manor stood. When Nancy reached the highway, she was just in time to see him leap into a parked car and drive off. The young detective was exasperated. She'd only a glimpse of his profile. If only she could have seen his full face, and if she'd have been able to get the license number of his car, that would have been so helpful. I wonder if he's the one who dropped the newspaper, though. Maybe he's from River Heights. She thought about this and thought that the man himself was maybe not one of the property owners, but was hired by Willie Wharton or one of the others to abduct Mr. Drew. I've got to phone this in to the police, Nancy thought. So she ran all the way back across the field to her own car, turned it on, and turned around and headed straight for Twin Elms. When she arrived, she sped to the phone in the hallway and dialed the Cliffwood Police Department. In a moment, she was talking to the captain and gave him all the latest information. Well, this certainly looks like you've picked up some good clues, Miss Drew. I'll send out an alarm immediately to have this man picked up. I don't suppose there's any news of my father, she asked. I'm afraid not, he said. But a couple of our men talked to a taxi driver named Harry, and he gave us a pretty good description of the man who came along the road while your father was lying unconscious in the grass. The one who offered to take him to the hospital. What did he look like? Nancy asked. The officer described the man as being in his early 50s, short and heavy set, and had shifty pale blue eyes. Well, Nancy said, I can think of several men who fit that description. So, did he have any other outstanding characteristics? Harry didn't notice anything except the fellow's hands didn't look like he was ever capable of doing any physical work. The taxi man said they were soft and pudgy. Well, that eliminates all the men I know who are short and heavy-set with pale blue eyes. None of them sound like that, Nancy replied. But it will be a good identifying feature, the policeman reminded her. But I guess I'd better let you go so I can get that alarm out. Nancy said goodbye and hung up. She waited several seconds for the line to clear, then picked up the phone again and called Hannah. Before Nancy lay the sheet of newspaper from which the advertisement had been torn. The Drew residence, said a voice. Hannah, this is Nancy. Oh, how are you? Any news? I haven't found Dad yet, the young detective replied, and the police haven't either. But I have picked up a couple of clues. What are they? The housekeeper asked excitedly. Nancy told her about the man with the crinkly ear and said she was sure if the police captured him and he would talk, that they would find her father. Oh, I hope so, Hannah sighed. But, Nancy, remember, don't get discouraged. At this point, Helen came into the hall, and as she passed Nancy on her way to the stairs, she smiled. The young sleuth was about to ask Hannah to get the Drew's Tuesday copy of the River Heights Gazette when she heard a cracking noise overhead. Immediately, she decided the ghost might be at work again. Hannah, I'll call you later, Nancy said, and hung up. She had no sooner done this than Helen screamed, Nancy, run! The ceiling! She herself darted for the front door. Nancy looked up to see a tremendous crack in the ceiling, and the next instant the whole ceiling crashed down on them, and they were thrown to the floor. "Oh!" Helen moaned. She was covered with plaster and dust, and had been hit hard on the head, but she managed to call out from under the debris, "Nancy, Nancy, are you all right?" There was no answer. The noise had brought Miss Flora and Aunt Rosemary on the run from the kitchen, and they stared in horror at the scene before them. Nancy was laying on the floor unconscious, and Helen was too dazed to move. Oh my," Miss Flora exclaimed. She and Aunt Rosemary began stepping over the plaster, which now had filled the air with dust, and they sneezed again and again, but they kept making their way forward. Miss Flora, reaching Helen's side, started pulling aside chunks of broken plaster. Finally, she helped her great-granddaughter to her feet. "Oh, my dear, you're hurt," she said. I'll be all right in a minute," Helen insisted, choking on some of the dust. "But Nancy—" Aunt Rosemary had reached the unconscious girl, and with lightning speed she threw away the debris that was covering her. Whipping a handkerchief out of her pocket, she gently laid it over Nancy's face so that she would not breathe in any more dust. "Helen, do you feel strong enough to help me carry Nancy to the library?" she asked. "I think we should lay her on the couch there." "Oh, yes, Aunt Rosemary. Do you think she's badly hurt, though?" "I hope not," Rosemary replied. Nancy began to stir at this moment, and then her arm moved upward and she pulled the handkerchief over her face and blinked several times. "Oh, Nancy, thank goodness. You're going to be all right," said Aunt Rosemary kindly. "But please put this back over you. I don't want you to breathe in the dust." She took the handkerchief from Nancy and once more laid it across the girl's nose and mouth. Nancy smiled softly. "Now I remember. The ceiling fell." "Yes," said Helen. "It knocked you out for a few moments. Oh, Nancy, I hope you're not seriously hurt." Miss Flora, who was sneezing violently, insisted they get out of the dust. She began stepping across the debris, with Helen helping her, and when they reached the library, they went inside. Helen turned to help Nancy, but by this time she was standing up, leaning on Aunt Rosemary, and able to make her way across the hall on her own. Aunt Rosemary suggested calling a doctor, but Nancy assured them that it would not be necessary. "Oh, I'm just so thankful you girls weren't more seriously injured," Miss Flora said. "This is dreadful, just dreadful." "Do you think the ghost is responsible?" she asked. Her daughter replied at once. "No, Mother, I don't. Do you recall that for some time we've had a leak in the hall whenever it rained? The last time we had a storm, the whole ceiling was soaked. I think that weakened the plaster, and it fell all on its own." Miss Flora remarked that a new ceiling would be a heavy expense for them. "Oh dear, more troubles all the time. But I still just can't think about parting with my home." Nancy, who was now completely restored, said with a hint of a smile, "There's only one worry you might not have any more, Miss Flora." "What's that?" "Mr. Gomber," said Nancy. He may not be so interested in the property when he sees what happened." "I don't know," Aunt Rosemary spoke up. "He's very persistent." Nancy said she felt all right now and suggested that she and Helen start cleaning up the hallway. Miss Flora would not hear of it. "Rosemary and I are going to help," she said. Cartons were brought from the cellar, and one after the other was filled with the debris, and after it had been carried outdoors, mops and dust cloths were brought in to use, and within an hour all the gritty plaster and dust had been removed. The workers were weary after finishing the job, and just at that point is when the telephone rang. Nancy, being closest to it, answered, and Hannah was calling. "Nancy, what happened? I've been waiting over an hour for you to call back. What's the matter?" Nancy gave all the details. "Oh, what's going to happen to you next?" the worried housekeeper exclaimed. But Nancy laughed. "Something good, I hope, Hannah." She asked Hannah to look for her copy of the River Heights Gazette for last Tuesday. In a few minutes the housekeeper brought it to the phone, and Nancy asked her to turn to page 14. "It has classified ads," she said. "Now tell me what the ad is right in the center of the page." "You mean the one about used cars?" Yes, that must be it," Nancy replied, "because it's not in my paper." Hannah grew and said it was an ad for Aikens, a used car dealer at 24 Main Street in Hancock. "Now turn the page and tell me what is on the back of that." Hannah turned the page and said, "It's a story about a school picnic. Does either one of those help you?" "Yes, I believe so, Hannah. I believe you've given me the information I need. This may prove valuable. Thank you so much." After Nancy finished the call, she started to dial the police headquarters again, then changed her mind. The ghost might be hiding somewhere and listening. Or if he'd installed microphones at various points, any conversations could be picked up and recorded on a machine, even hidden a distance away. "It's going to be wiser for me to discuss the whole matter in person," Nancy decided to herself. So, divulging her destination only to Helen, she told the others she was going to drive downtown, but would not be gone long. "Are you sure you feel up to it?" Aunt Rosemary asked. "I am perfectly fine," Nancy assured her. So she set off in her convertible, hopeful that through the clue of the used car dealer, the police might be able to pick up the name of one of the suspects. They can track him down and find my dad. "Excellent," Captain Rosalind said when Nancy had told her story. "The way you're building up clues, if you were on my force, I'd recommend a citation for you and a raise." The young sleuth smiled and thanked him. "I've got to find my father," she said. "I'll call Captain McGinnis in River Heights," he told her. "Why don't you sit down here and wait? It shouldn't take long for them to get information from Aiken's used car lot." Nancy agreed, and presently he called to her. "I have some information for you, Miss Thru." She jumped up and went over to the desk. The officer told her that Captain McGinnis in River Heights had been most cooperative and had sent 2 men at once to the Aiken's used car lot. They had just returned. Day before yesterday, an athletic-looking man with a crinkly ear came and purchased a car. He showed a driver's license stating that he was Samuel Greenman from Huntsville. Nancy was excited about this information. "Then it's going to be easy to pick him up, won't it?" "I'm afraid not," Captain Rosalind explained. McGinnis learned from the Huntsville police that although Greenman is supposed to live at the address he gave, it's reported that he has been out of town for quite some time. "So no one knows where he's at?" she asked. "Not any of his neighbors?" The officer agreed, and also reported that Samuel Greenman was a person of questionable character. He was wanted for a couple of robbery charges, and police in several other states were on the lookout for him. "Well, if the man I saw at my car is Samuel Greenman, he's hiding in this area, I believe," Nancy told Captain Rosalind, who smiled. "And are you going to suggest that he might be the ghost at Twin Elms?" "Who knows?" Nancy shrugged. "In any case," Captain Rosalind said, "your idea that he may be hiding out around here is a good one." Nancy was about to thank the officer and ask him another question when his phone rang. A moment later he said, "Miss Thru, it's for you." The girl detective picked the receiver up and said, "Hello?" The caller was Helen Corning, and her voice was frantic. Oh, Nancy, you've got to come. You've got to come at once. Something dreadful's happened." "What is it?" Nancy cried, but Helen had hung up the phone. Nancy told Captain Rosalind of the urgent request and said she had to leave at once. "Well, let me know if you need the police," the officer called after her. "Oh, thank you so much. I will." Nancy drove to Twin Elms as fast as the law allowed her to, and as she pulled up in front of the house, she was startled to see a doctor's car there. Someone was sick. Helen met her friend at the door. "Nancy, Miss Flora. She may have had a heart attack." "Oh, no," Nancy said, shocked. "Tell me all about it." "Dr. Morrison wants Miss Flora to go to the hospital, but she refuses. She says she is not leaving here." Helen said the doctor was still upstairs, attending her great-grandmother. "When did she become ill?" Nancy asked. "Did something in particular happen?" "Yes," Helen nodded. "It was so frightening. Miss Flora, Aunt Rosemary, and I were in the kitchen talking about supper. They wanted to have a special dish to surprise you, because they know how upset you are over your father." "That was so sweet of them," Nancy remarked. "But please go on, Helen." "Miss Flora became rather tired, and Aunt Rosemary suggested she go upstairs and lie down. She had just started up the stairway when, for some unknown reason, she turned to look back, and there in the parlor stood a man." "A caller?" "No," Helen said. "Miss Flora said he was an ugly, horrible-looking person, unshaven, and his hair was long." "Do you think he was the ghost?" Nancy inquired. Miss Flora thought so. Well, she didn't scream. You know, she's really terribly brave. She just decided to go down and meet him herself. And then what do you think happened? I could guess any number of things. So just tell me, please. Helen said that when Mrs. Turnbull had reached the parlor, no one was there, and there was no secret door open. What did Miss Flora do then? Nancy asked. She fainted. At this moment, a tall, slender, gray-haired man carrying a doctor bag walked down the stairs. Helen introduced Nancy to him, and then they asked about the patient. Well, fortunately, Miss Flora is going to be all right. She is an amazing woman. With plenty of rest and nothing more to worry her, I believe she'll be fine in no time. In fact, she may be able to be up for short periods by this time tomorrow. Oh, I'm so relieved, said Helen. I'm terribly fond of my great-grandmother. I wouldn't want anything to happen to her, especially under these circumstances. Well, I'm going to do all I can, but you're going to have to help, the physician smiled. How, and what can we do? Nancy asked quickly. The doctor said that no one was to talk about the ghost. Miss Flora says that she saw a man in the parlor and that he must have come in by way of some secret entrance. Now, you know as well as I do that such a thing is not plausible. Well, the man couldn't have entered this house any other way, Helen said quickly. Every window and door on the first floor is kept locked. You've heard of hallucinations, haven't you? The doctor asked with raised eyebrows. Nancy and Helen frowned but remained silent. They were certain that Miss Flora had not had an hallucination. If she had said there was a man in the parlor, there had been one. Call me if you need me before tomorrow, the doctor said as he moved toward the front door. Otherwise, I'll drop in sometime before noon. After he left, the two girls exchanged glances. Are you going to search the parlor again? Nancy asked. You bet I am, Helen responded. Shall we start now or wait until after supper? Although Nancy was eager to begin at once, she thought it would be best if she went to extend her sympathies to Miss Flora and wish her well. She also felt that a delay in serving supper while the search went on might upset Miss Flora. Helen offered to go to the kitchen at once and start preparing the meal, and Nancy went up the stairs. Miss Flora had been put to bed in her daughter's room to avoid any further scares. Oh, Miss Flora, I'm so sorry you have to stay in bed, said Nancy, walking up and smiling at the patient. I am too, Miss Flora replied, and I think it's a lot of nonsense. Everybody faints once in a while. If you'd ever seen what I did, oh, that horrible face, you would have fainted too. Mother, pleaded Aunt Rosemary, who was seated in the chair by her bed. Please don't talk about it. You know what the doctor said. Oh, doctors, her mother said pettishly. Anyway, Nancy, I know that was the ghost. Now you just look for a man who hasn't shaved in a goodness knows how long and has an ugly face, kind of longish hair. It was on the tip of Nancy's tongue to ask for information on the man's height and size, but she recalled the doctor's warning, so she said nothing. Instead, she smiled, and taking one of Miss Flora's hands in her own, she said, Let's not talk about this any more until you're up and well. Then I'll put you on the Drew and Company detective squad. How's that sound? The amusing remark made the elderly woman smile, and she promised to try getting some rest. But first, I do want something to eat. Do you think you girls can manage alone? I'd really like Rosemary to stay with me. Of course we can, and we'll bring you exactly what you should have to eat. Nancy went downstairs to set the tray for Miss Flora. Steaming chicken soup, a thin slice of toasted bread, and a saucer of plain jello. In a few minutes, Helen took another tray upstairs with a more substantial meal on it for Aunt Rosemary. Then the two girls sat down together in the dining room to have their own supper. After finishing, they quickly washed and dried all the dishes and then started for the parlor. Where do you think we should look? Helen asked in a whisper. During the past half hour, Nancy had been going over in her mind what spot in the parlor they might have overlooked, one which could possibly have an opening behind it. She decided on a large cabinet built into the wall. It contained a beautiful collection of figurines, souvenirs from many places, and knickknacks. I'm going to look for a hidden spring that may move the cabinet, Nancy said in a very low voice. For the first time she noticed that each of the figurines and knickknacks were set in small depressions on the shelves. Nancy wondered if this had been done so they would not fall over if it was moved. Eagerly she began to look on the back wall of the interior of the cabinet for a spring. She and Helen together searched every inch of the upper part, but found no spring to move the great built-in piece of furniture. On the lower part were two doors which Nancy had already opened many times. But then she had been looking for a large opening. Now she was looking for a tiny spring or a movable panel. Helen searched the left side, Nancy searched the right. Suddenly her pulse quickened in anticipation. She had felt a spot slightly higher than the rest. Nancy ran her fingers back and forth across the area, which was about an inch and a half high and 3 inches long. It may have something concealed behind it, she thought, and she pushed gently. Nancy felt a vibration. Helen, I found something. Better stand back, she whispered. Nancy pressed harder, and this time the right side of the cabinet began to move forward. Nancy jumped up from her knees and stood back with Helen. Slowly, very slowly, one end of the cabinet began to move into the parlor, the other into an open space behind it. Helen grabbed Nancy's hand. What were they going to find in the secret passage? The great crystal chandelier illuminated the narrow passageway behind the cabinet. It was not very long, no one was in it, and the place was dusty and filled with cobwebs. There's probably an exit at the other end of this, Nancy whispered. Let's see where it goes. I think I'd better wait here, Nancy, Helen suggested. This old cabinet might suddenly start to close. If it does, I'll yell so you can get out in time. Nancy laughed. You're a real pal, Helen. As Nancy walked along the passageway, she carefully looked at the two walls which lined it. No visible exit from either on the solid plastered walls. The far end, too, was solid, but this wall had been built of wood. Nancy felt it might have some significance. At the moment, she could not figure it out, and started to return to the parlor. Halfway along the narrow corridor, she saw a folded piece of paper. Ooh, this might prove to be an important clue, she said to herself, picking it up. Just as Nancy stepped back into the parlor, Aunt Rosemary appeared and stared in astonishment. You found something? She asked. Only this, Nancy replied, and handed Aunt Rosemary the folded paper. The girls looked over her shoulder as Mrs. Hayes opened it. This is an unfinished letter. Why, this letter was written in 1785, not long after the house was built, she said excitedly. The note read, My honorable friend Benjamin, the disloyalty of 2 of my servants has just come to my attention. I am afraid they plan to harm the cause of the colonies. I will have them properly punished. My good fortune in learning about this disloyalty came when I was at my listening post. Every word spoken in the servants' sitting room can be overheard by me. I will watch for further. And that was it. The letter ended at that point. Instantly Helen said, Listening post? What listening post? It must be at the end of the passageway, Nancy guessed, and Aunt Rosemary, she then turned and asked, what room would connect with it? I presume the kitchen, Miss Hayes replied, and it seems to me that I once heard that the present kitchen was a sitting room for the servants long ago. Because if you'll recall, back in colonial days, food was never cooked in the mansion. It was always prepared in another building and brought in on large trays. Helen smiled. With a listening post, the poor servants here didn't have a chance for a good chit-chat together. Their conversations were never secret. Nancy and Aunt Rosemary smiled and nodded. Then the young sleuth said, Let's see if this listening post still works. It was arranged that Helen would go into the kitchen and start talking. Nancy would stand at the end of the corridor to listen. Aunt Rosemary, who was shown how to work the hidden spring on the cabinet, would act as a guard if the great piece of furniture suddenly started to close. All ready? Helen asked. She moved out to the room. When she thought Nancy was at her post, she began to talk about her forthcoming wedding and asked Nancy to be in the bridal party. I can hear Helen plainly, Nancy called excitedly to Aunt Rosemary. This listening post is as good as ever. When the test was over and the cabinet manual closed by Nancy, she, Helen, and Aunt Rosemary held a whispered conversation. They all decided that the ghost knew about the passage and overheard plans which those in the house were making. Probably this was where the ghost disappeared after Miss Flora spotted him. "Funny that we seem to do more planning while we're in the kitchen than any other room," Aunt Rosemary remarked. Helen said she wondered if this listening post was unique with the owner and the architect of Twin Elms. No, indeed, Aunt Rosemary told her. Many old homes where there were servants had such places. Don't forget, our country had been involved in several wars during which traders and spies found it easy to get information while posing as servants. "Oh, that's so clever," Helen remarked. "And I suppose a lot of people who were caught never knew how they had been found out." "No doubt," said Aunt Rosemary. At that moment they heard Miss Flora's feeble voice calling, and hurried up the steps to be sure she was all right. They found her smiling, but she complained that she did not like being left alone for so long. "I'm not going to leave you again tonight, Mother," Aunt Rosemary promised. "I'm even going to sleep on the couch in this room so you won't be disturbed. Now, please rest and try to get a little sleep." The following morning Nancy had a phone call from Hannah, whose voice sounded very irate. "I just heard from Mr. Bairdale, the railroad lawyer, Nancy. He lost your address and phone number, so he called here. I'm furious at what he had to say. He hinted that your father might be staying away on purpose because he wasn't able to produce Willie Wharton." "No, that is definitely unfair and untrue," Nancy cried in anger, too. "Well, I just wouldn't stand for it if I were you," Hannah said flatly, "and that's only the half of it." "You mean he had more things to say about Dad?" Nancy questioned quickly. No, not that," the housekeeper answered. "He was calling to say that the railroad can't hold up the bridge project any longer. If some new evidence isn't produced by Monday, they're going to be forced to accede to the demands of Willie Wharton and all those other property owners." "Oh, my goodness. Oh, wouldn't it be a great blow to Dad?" Nancy said. "He wouldn't want that to happen. He's sure that the signature on that contract of sale is Willie Wharton's. Now all he has to do is find Willie Wharton and prove it." "Oh, everything is such a mess," said Mrs. Gruen. "I was talking to the police just before I called you, and they still have no leads as to where your father might be." "Oh, Hannah, this is so awful," Nancy said. "I don't know how, but I intend to find Dad, and I'm going to do it quickly, too." After the conversation between herself and the housekeeper was over, Nancy walked up and down the hall, up and down the hall, up and down the hall, as she tried to formulate a plan. Something had to be done. Suddenly Nancy went to the front door, opened it, and walked outside, and breathed deeply of the lovely morning air, and headed for the rose garden. She let the full beauty of the estate sink into her consciousness before permitting herself to think further about the problem before her. Long ago, Mr. Drew had taught Nancy that the best way to clear one's head is to commune with nature for a time. So Nancy went up one walk and down the other, listening to the birds and now and then the song of a meadowlark. Again she smelled deeply of the roses and the sweet wisteria which hung over the sagging arbor. 10 minutes later she returned to the house and sat down on the porch. Almost at once a mental image of Nathan Gomber came to her as clearly as if the man was standing in front of her. Her mind began to put together various pieces of the puzzle regarding him and the railroad property. Maybe, just maybe, Nathan Gomber is keeping Willie Wharton away, she thought to herself. Willie may even be a prisoner himself. And if Gomber is that kind of person, maybe he engineered the abduction of my father. Oh, the very thought of this both angered and frightened Nancy. But leaping up, she decided to ask the police to have Nathan Gomber followed. "I'll go down to headquarters and talk to Captain Rosslyn, and I'll ask Helen to go along. The cleaning woman is here, so she can help Aunt Rosemary if there is any sort of emergency." Without explaining her real purpose in wanting to go downtown, Nancy merely asked Helen to accompany her there for some necessary marketing. So the girls drove off, and on the way to town Nancy gave Helen the full details of her latest theories about Nathan Gomber. Helen was amazed. "And here he is acting so worried about your father's safety." When the girls reached headquarters, they had to wait a few minutes to see Captain Rosslyn. Nancy fidgeted because of the delay. Every moment seemed precious. But finally the girls were ushered inside his office, and he greeted them warmly. "Do you have another clue, Miss Drew?" he asked with a smile. Nancy quickly told her story. "Oh, well, I do think you're on the right track, the officer said, and I'll be glad to get in touch with your friend Captain McGinnis in River Heights again and relay the message. I'll also notify all the men on my force to be on the lookout for this Nathan Gomber character. Thank you, Nancy said gratefully. Every hour that goes by, I become more and more worried about my father. We're going to get a break soon, he assured her kindly, and the minute I hear anything, you will be the first to know. Nancy thanked him, and then both girls went on their way. It took every bit of Nancy's stamina not to show her true feelings. She rolled the cart through the supermarket almost automatically, picking out the items they needed. Her mind would say, we need more canned peas because the ghost took what we had, and then the meat counter, she reflected, Dad loves thick, juicy steaks. Finally, the marketing was finished, and the packages stowed in the rear of the convertible, and on the way home, Helen asked Nancy what plans she had for the mystery now. To tell the truth, I've been thinking about it continuously, but so far I don't have any ideas, Nancy answered. I'm sure, though, that something will come to mind. When the girls were a little distance from the entrance to Twin Elms, they saw a car suddenly pull out of the driveway and make a right turn. The driver leaned out the window and looked back with a smug grin. That's Nathan Gomber, Nancy cried out. And did you see that smirk on his face? Helen asked. Oh, Nancy, maybe that means he finally persuaded Miss Flora to sell the property to him. Oh, I'm afraid you're right. And also, here I've just asked the police to shadow him, and I'm the first one to see him. With that, Nancy sped up and shot ahead. As she passed the driveway to the estate, Helen asked, Where are you going? I'm following Nathan Gomber until I catch him, Nancy replied. Okay, we're going to stop there. Okay, and we'll see what happens. I wonder if Nancy will catch Nathan Gomber. I wonder if Miss Flora has decided to sell or not. We'll find out, okay? I'll see you next time.